When the HOA destroyed the only bridge connecting me to my family's land, a bridge my father built with his own hands, I thought they'd broken more than wood and steel. What they didn't know was that by tearing down that bridge, they opened a door to a battle far bigger than property lines. I didn't just fight back. I bought the dam controlling the entire lake and slowly drained their $7 million waterfront mansions dry. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about power, legacy, and how water flows only where it's allowed. Stay with me, because this war started with a bridge and ended with a flood of justice no one saw coming. I never thought a strip of weathered cedar and steel bolts could mean so much to me. But the bridge had been more than just a connection from my side of the cove to the rest of the world. It was my father's hands in every plank, my mother's, laughter in every echo across the water. My own history etched into the railings where, as a kid, I'd carved my initials alongside the smell of varnish and fresh river breeze. It was the artery that tied our land, our family, and our dignity together. 120 feet of craftsmanship spanning the narrowest point of Lake Harriston, where the current slowed just enough to mirror the clouds, and for 35 years it stood solid against storms, ice, and time itself, until the HOA decided it was an eyesore. I can still see that first letter, delivered not by mail but by some smirking board member who must have thought knocking on my door in his pressed polo shirt would make the insult more palatable, a folded paper trembling in his manicured fingers. As he said with a kind of rehearsed sympathy, the board has voted to have the bridge removed for safety concerns. I knew then that safety was just their favorite word for we want control. Because if safety were really the concern, they wouldn't have built a playground on the far shore right next to a steep embankment with no guardrail. Or ignored the rotting dock on Lot 14 that had already sent 2 people to urgent care. The bridge wasn't even on HOA land. It sat entirely on the easement my father had secured back in 1986, recorded in county records with language so clear even a high school civics student could see it was ours. But they'd grown used to acting as though the lake, the shore, and the air above it belonged to them, and maybe most people just rolled over when they came knocking. But I wasn't most people. At first, I tried the civil route. I attended their meetings. I brought binders of inspection reports proving the bridge was structurally sound. I offered to fund a cosmetic restoration at my own expense. But every time I spoke, they cut me off. Every time I submitted a proposal, they tabled it for further review. And every time I looked around that horseshoe-shaped conference table, I could see they'd already decided my words didn't matter. They weren't after safety, they were after power. The kind of petty, small-town dominance that thrives in gated communities where property lines are sharp and grudges are sharper. My bridge represented independence. And independence scared them because if one man could maintain his own infrastructure without HOA blessing, what else might others decide to do without permission? That's the thing about people who get drunk on authority. They see self-reliance as rebellion. The weeks turned into months of tension, subtle harassment replacing neighborly small talk. Trash bags would mysteriously appear on my side of the cove, blocking the path. Contractors I'd hired to do maintenance would get phone calls from concerned board members warning them about liability. And more than once I came home to find someone had unbolted a railing or loosened planks in the night, trying to create the very hazards they accused me of ignoring. I reported it to the sheriff's department. But vandalism on private property without cameras is just another word for good luck proving it. And the HOA knew it. The turning point, the moment the simmering feud turned into a war, came on a damp Saturday morning in late spring, when the fog was still lifting off the water and the smell of fresh rain lingered in the air. I heard the engines first, the low growl of diesel reverberating across the lake, and when I stepped outside with my coffee, I saw them. 2 flatbed trucks parked at the cul-de-sac, one carrying a skid steer, the other loaded with stacks of orange. Plastic fencing. Men in hard hats and reflective vests, contractors, not county workers, were unloading tools, and standing among them was Dale Carmichael, the HOA president, his windbreaker zipped tight, his clipboard in hand like some kind of general surveying a battlefield. "You don't have authority to be here," I called out as I walked down the slope toward the bridge, my voice steady but loud enough to carry. Dale smiled, not the friendly kind, but that smug, thin-lipped smirk I'd seen in courtrooms, when lawyers know the other side doesn't yet realize they're losing. "We've got an emergency removal order," he said, holding up a piece of paper I didn't need to read to know it was garbage. "Unsafe structure. Immediate hazard. To residents." Behind him, 2 workers were already hauling a generator and a cutting torch toward the bridge's western support beam. I planted myself squarely on the decking, the cedar damp under my boots, and told them flatly, "Anyone who sets foot on this bridge without my permission is trespassing, and I will have you arrested." One of the contractors glanced nervously at Dale, who gestured for them to hang back, but I knew this was just a pause, not a retreat. We stood like that for a long minute, staring each other down while the morning light broke through the mist, and in that moment I realized they weren't just trying to remove a bridge. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I broke. The thing is, they didn't understand that this wasn't about some planks over water to me. This was about the last piece of my father's legacy, about the years he spent hauling timbers across the ice in winter because there was no road access, about the afternoons we'd sit on the railing together and watch herons land in the shallows. They thought this was a negotiation, but it was a declaration of war, and wars aren't won by playing defense forever. I wish I could say that standoff on the bridge bought me time, but in reality it just gave the HOA a clearer picture of how much the structure meant to me. And when people like Dale Carmichael see you have something precious, they don't step back, they double down, because the destruction of what you love becomes the sharpest tool in their arsenal. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in psychological attrition, the kind of low-grade harassment that never makes headlines but gnaws at you in the quiet hours, eroding your patience until they can call your reaction irrational and smile while they do it. They started with paperwork. Violation notices slipped into my mailbox accusing me of everything from unauthorized shoreline modification — the bridge had been there for decades before the HOA even existed — to failure to maintain community aesthetic, a phrase so vague it could have been written about the color of the sky. Each letter came with a fine, small at first but compounding daily, the kind of administrative extortion they knew most homeowners just pay to avoid the headache. But I didn't pay a cent, not out of stubbornness, but because paying would mean acknowledging their authority over something they didn't own. Then came the sabotage. Twice I found the bolts on the eastern anchor plates loosened, once to the point where the decking shifted under my weight, and I knew enough about torque patterns to recognize it wasn't accidental wear. Someone had taken a wrench to my bridge. The sheriff's deputy, the same one I'd talked to before, gave me the same speech about private property disputes and civil remedies, which in plain English meant I'd need to take them to court, a process that would take months, if not years, and in the meantime, nothing stopped them from escalating. They escalated. It was early July when the notice came by certified mail, a formal emergency abatement order signed not by any government agency, but by the HOA's own safety committee, which sounded official enough to trick someone who didn't know better. They'd scheduled the removal for no later than July 14th, citing imminent structural failure and risk of injury to residents. I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity had tipped over into something surreal, like watching a bad movie where the villains are so cartoonish you almost admire their commitment to the role. Still, I called my lawyer, a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Karen Yu who'd made a career out of dismantling HOA overreach, and she filed an injunction the next morning. We thought we'd bought time. We were wrong. The morning of July 12th was bright and windless, the lake a perfect sheet of glass reflecting the clouds, and I was inside going through old photos of the bridge, partly for evidence, partly for comfort. when I heard the sound of metal on metal, a shriek that didn't belong in the stillness. I ran outside and saw them. 3 trucks, 2 flatbeds, and a dump truck, backed up along the shore, and a crew of 6 men already at work with cutting torches, sending sparks into the water as the air filled with the acrid tang of burning steel. At the center of it all was Dale, his clipboard replaced with a bullhorn, barking orders like some tin pot dictator. Beside him stood a man in a county public works vest, and for a second I thought maybe, just maybe, this was legitimate. Until I got close enough to see the logo patch peeling at the edges and the missing county seal on his ID badge. I shouted for them to stop, my voice carrying across the water, but the torches didn't slow. I stepped onto the bridge, but before I could reach them, one of the workers swung a crowbar down on the handrail, splintering cedar that had stood untouched for 35 years. I didn't think. I just charged forward, grabbing the nearest man's arm and yanking him back from the support beam. He stumbled, cursed, and raised his torch like he might swing it, but Dale was already in my face, yelling something about interfering with a lawful order. I told him the only lawful order here was the one from the county clerk showing my family's easement, but he just smiled, that same thin-lipped smile, and nodded toward the far shore. That's when I saw it. A small aluminum skiff anchored. Just beyond the bridge, 2 men leaning over the water with a portable saw cutting into the midspan from below. They weren't just dismantling it, they were making sure it couldn't be salvaged. I tried calling the sheriff, but the dispatcher told me there was already an active service call at my address. Minutes later, 2 deputies arrived. But instead of stopping the destruction, they walked straight to Dale, shook his hand, and stood back like bored spectators. One of them told me quietly, "They've got some kind of emergency removal paperwork. You'll have to take it up with the court." By the time the sun was overhead, the bridge was gone, its cedar planks piled like firewood in the back of the dump truck, the steel trusses cut into jagged sections and winched onto the flatbeds. All that remained were 2 lonely concrete piers, rising from the water, empty and useless. I stood there, the July heat pressing down like a weight, watching as they hauled away the last piece of my father's work, and something inside me hardened. It wasn't grief anymore. It was clarity, a cold, precise understanding that these people would keep taking until I had nothing left, unless I found a way to make them understand that I could take from them, too. And as I looked out over the lake, the same lake their $1-million houses clung to like jewels on a necklace, I remembered something my father had once told me when I was a boy and we'd gone upstream to fish. Water gives life, but it only flows where it's allowed. 2. A mile and a half north of here, hidden by pines and a bend in the river, sat the Harriston Dam, built in the 1950s, decommissioned in the 80s, and now just a quiet concrete giant holding back the lake. If a man controlled that dam, he controlled the lake. And if he controlled the lake, he controlled the HOA. It's funny how an idea can start as a whisper in your mind, just a flicker of possibility. And then, the more you turn it over, the more it begins to hum with inevitability until you can't imagine doing anything else. That was me with the dam. Because once the bridge was gone and the shock had cooled into something harder, I couldn't shake the thought that the most effective way to deal with people like Dale Carmichael wasn't to argue or sue or work through the system, but to change the very conditions of their comfort. And in this lakefront kingdom of manicured lawns and imported stone patios, comfort came from water, shimmering blue and still under the summer sun, a mirror for the egos of the people who built their $1-million dreams along its shore. Harriston Dam was the unspoken foundation of all of it. A 200-foot wide, 30-foot high relic of mid-century engineering that held back not just the lake, but the illusion of permanence that the HOA had sold to its residents. I knew the dam's history because my father used to tell it like a folk tale. How it was built in '54 to power a small textile mill, how it changed hands in the '70s when the mill shut down, how the county eventually took over for flood control, before decommissioning it in 1987 when the new upstream reservoir was built. After that, it was just there, a chunk of concrete and steel gates with no active purpose, falling into bureaucratic limbo. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that property in limbo is an opportunity for anyone patient enough to untangle the red tape. I started with the county property records, which, after a morning in the assessor's office and a lot of bad coffee, revealed that the dam was technically owned by a defunct water utility that had been dissolved in 1994. In legal terms, it was orphan infrastructure, which meant it was eligible for acquisition if a buyer could prove they had a beneficial use and a plan for maintenance. Most people would have stopped there. The process alone was a labyrinth of forms, hearings, and liability insurance, but I had two things going for me: a background in civil engineering from my years designing rural roadways, and a stubborn streak that the HOA had already underestimated. I contacted my lawyer, Karen Yu, and we began building the paper trail, an LLC I set up under a nondescript name, a proposed plan to restore and maintain the dam as a historic structure with potential hydroelectric capacity. Technically, true if I ever wanted to install a microturbine, and letters of support from a few strategically chosen local businesses that wouldn't mind seeing the HOA taken down a peg. At the same time, I kept my mouth shut in public. Let Dale think I was licking my wounds, maybe even considering selling the property, which I let slip accidentally to one of his board members who loved gossiping more than breathing. Behind the scenes, every step was a dance with the county clerk, the Public Works Department, and the remnants of the utilities' corporate filings. 3 times I hit dead ends where it looked like the dam might revert to state ownership, but each time Karen found a way to nudge the process forward, reminding whoever sat across the table that my LLC was offering to assume full maintenance liability, something no government agency wanted to pay for. By late September, the deal was within reach, though the final hurdle was a public hearing where interested parties could object. I knew the HOA would try to block me if they caught wind, so I made sure the notice in the legal section of the county paper ran in the smallest font legally allowed, buried between foreclosure listings and tax liens. The hearing was sparsely attended. Just me, Karen, the county commissioner, and 2 retirees who'd wandered in from the wrong meeting. And in under 20 minutes, the motion passed unanimously. 2 weeks later, my LLC owned Harriston Dam, free and clear, for less than the cost of a used pickup. On paper, I had bought it to preserve a piece of local history. In reality, I had just acquired the spigot to the HOA's lifeblood. Controlling the dam meant I controlled the water level of Lake Harriston, and while there were regulations about minimum ecological flow, there was nothing that said I couldn't lower the lake to the point where every boat dock in the HOA's jurisdiction sat high and dry, every manicured shoreline turned into a mudflat, and every $1 million view became a panorama of cracked earth and stranded pontoon lifts. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to break a single law to make it happen. All I had to do was schedule maintenance drawdowns, a common and perfectly legal practice for dam owners to inspect gates and spillways. The first time, it would just be a warning shot, a 6-foot drop in water level over the course of a week, just enough for residents to notice their perfect reflections turning into shallow puddles surrounded by cattails. But that was only the beginning. I spent the winter quietly repairing the old gate controls, installing new seals, and a remote monitoring system I could operate from my phone, all under the guise of restoration work. By spring, the machinery purred like it had in the 50s, ready for whatever I told it to do. And when the thaw came and the lake filled again, I stood on the dam one crisp April morning, looking out at the glittering water stretching toward the HOA's prized shoreline, and I thought of my father's words. Water only flows where it's allowed to. The HOA had destroyed my bridge thinking they'd cut me off from the rest of the world. They didn't realize I was building a far bigger bridge, one that spanned from their arrogance straight to their downfall. The morning I flipped the switch and opened the dam's sluice gates, I stood alone on the cold concrete platform, the weight of every moment since that bridge was torn down, pressing down on me like the thick summer humidity that settled over Lake Harriston before a storm. I could hear the faint hiss of water spilling through the spillway, the steady, almost meditative sound that was both a beginning and an end. I had wrested control from the hands that thought they could erase my family's legacy with a few swings of a torch, and now I was the one holding the power to rewrite the rules, to turn the tide on the smug homeowners who'd looked down on me, whose waterfront mansions gleamed like trophies on the ridge above the shrinking lake. They didn't know it yet, but their idyllic paradise was about to become a mud-flat nightmare, a slow-motion unraveling of everything they'd built on water that now drained inch by inch into the swollen river below. The first signs were subtle. Pontoon boats resting awkwardly on cracked pilings, docks stretching useless arms over dry earth, the frantic calls to contractors who told them the water was unusually low. But by the second week, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, a gathering of suits and sunbathers, faces tight with confusion and rising panic, eyes darting toward, their phones and laptops searching for answers they couldn't find. I followed the news through local reporters' updates, watched the Facebook group explode with posts demanding accountability, accused of everything from government conspiracy to environmental sabotage. But I stayed quiet, letting their anxiety build like the lake itself was conspiring against them. Meanwhile, I walked the edges of the shrinking shoreline, camera in hand, capturing the transformation of the place that had been my home and their playground, the mud cracking and heaving under the sun, dead fish washing up where the water receded, the herons circling in confusion as their hunting grounds vanished. There was a poetic justice in seeing their pristine views replaced by the raw, ugly truth of dry land. The foundation beneath their $7 million homes was no longer solid water but brittle earth, and I savored every moment of their discomfort, not out of cruelty, but as a reckoning for the bridge they'd destroyed, the respect they'd denied, and the legacy they'd tried to erase. Predictably, the HOA launched lawsuits, throwing accusations of reckless endangerment, property damage, and environmental violations at me like weapons. Their attorneys drafted cease and desist letters, but every claim collapsed under the scrutiny of the documents Karen and I had prepared. The dam was mine. I had followed every legal protocol, and maintenance drawdowns were a common practice in every dam-owning community in the country. The courts had little choice but to let me continue, and the publicity only made the residents more desperate and more divided, some begging for a compromise, others threatening vigilante action. I watched from the sidelines as the community fractured, longtime neighbors turning against each other, social gatherings dissolving into angry debates over Facebook and town hall meetings, the tension palpable like a storm about to break. Meanwhile, I maintained the dam remotely, opening and closing the gates in a rhythm that matched the rising and falling panic, carefully calibrated to maximize inconvenience without crossing into illegal territory. Months passed, the lake's surface falling nearly 8 feet below normal summer levels, revealing the detritus and decay hidden beneath for decades, the skeletal remains of forgotten piers, rusted anchors and long-sunken debris. The HOA's prized lawns turned into soggy mud patches. Landscaping companies struggled to salvage lawns that hadn't seen natural irrigation in weeks, and the value of waterfront properties started to crater in the real estate market. Appraisals came back with red ink and dismal forecasts, the kind of cold financial reality that finally made the homeowners sit up and take notice. But what surprised me most was how quickly some residents came to me, not in anger, but in desperate hope, offering to buy my dam share, promising full cooperation if I'd just release the water, restore their lake, and end the siege. I listened politely, aware that this was the power I'd wanted all along. Leverage not just over a board of bullies, but over an entire community that had taken water for granted. I never accepted any of their offers, not because I wanted to punish them endlessly, but because I wanted them to understand the lesson my father had taught me so long ago. Water flows only where it's allowed, and control is the truest form of power. Eventually, the HOA was forced to concede, agreeing to negotiate on terms far more favorable to me than any settlement they dreamed of before the bridge was burned. I insisted on infrastructure upgrades, formal easement acknowledgments, and a yearly contribution to a fund dedicated to preserving the history and environment of Lake Harriston, terms that ensured my family's legacy would not just survive, but thrive. As the lake slowly refilled with the spring thaw and rains, I stood once more on what remained of my shoreline, no bridge to cross but a dam under my control, and a community that had learned the hard way that respect isn't given. It's earned, often at a price. And in that quiet moment, as the water lapped against the concrete walls and the sun set behind the wooded ridge, I felt a profound sense of justice, not born of vengeance, but of balance restored, a story written in water and stone, and finally, in my favor.